All right, folks. Well, we're at about 5 past. We have about 7 people here. I knew we're going to have a small group tonight. So why don't we get started just to respect everyone's time? Um, if we have not met, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Danielle Figuera. I'm the Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement at Landmark. And this is my 4th school year. It's such a pleasure to be at Landmark, and I really appreciate you all sharing your students with us. And this topic is something that typically would be presented at Parents' Days. Is that correct, Megan?
That
Yeah,
is
so Megan's given this presentation many, many times before. She's an absolute expert in this content. Megan's been at Landmark for 15 years and is our EMS reading supervisor and testing coordinator. So this is one of her busier, if they can ever be busier, weeks of the school year, navigating MCAS in an even more complicated environment. So I bow to you, Megan, and I hand the mic to you to walk us through this presentation tonight. And I welcome everyone to ask questions throughout the presentation. You're welcome to just unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you'd prefer to put it in the chat and type it in, I'll happily interrupt Megan and read it out loud. So you're welcome to do either of those. And questions are really helpful throughout the presentation so that we're answering in a timely fashion. But as I said, it's a small group tonight, so we get to have a really intimate conversation, and happy that you are here. Just note that tonight is being recorded. We'll share the recording after the event, and we'll also share the slides. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or ask in person. And I'll hand it to you, Megan. Thanks so much.
excellent. Thank you, Danielle. So we are talking about understanding standardized test scores. We will not be covering MCAS. We're going to cover the types of scores that we use in our planning through EMS, as far as looking at progress students have made and thinking about best fitting tutorials and that type of thing. And as Danielle said, I really do appreciate having questions throughout. It's material I think not everyone feels like an expert in, and we'll dive into it as much as you want to. So this is me. I am the EMS reading supervisor and testing coordinator. I'm including my email. I love to chat about testing. So if you want to reach out with a question, feel free. Your advisor is also an excellent resource if you want to ask questions specific to your students' testing. This is the type of testing sheet that you would get at the end of the year. They come out with our June reports. They're kind of the last page that's connected. And when you look at this, I just like to review how you read it, because it looks like a whole bunch of numbers throughout. So when you're looking at it, you want to start actually on the far side of the sheet where it says 2017-18. That is kind of the oldest. And as you get closer and where it gets bold in the left-hand column, that's the most recent testing. So that's probably what you're going to care the most about. We're in the midst of completing our end of year testing at this point. So most students don't actually have a full testing sheet yet, but they will by the time we send those home. So before we get into the types of tests that we give and why we give those, I like to talk about the types of scores that you see, because there are lots of different types of scores, and a lot of times people gravitate towards one score or another, and that tends to leave you with only partial information, and sometimes it can be more confusing information rather than helpful information. So the more you know about all the different types of scores and which ones you want to look at for what reasons, the better. So we're going to go over each different one of these: raw scores, percentiles, standard scores, stanines, and grade equivalents, and then we'll jump into the tests. So a raw score is probably the simplest type of score that you can talk about. It basically means the number of points your student achieved on any given test. So on the listening comprehension, this bottom one, they answered 16 correctly. The problem with a raw score is you don't necessarily know what is it out of and whether that's good or bad, if we want to use those terms. But it can be the most useful score in comparing your child to your child. Because if you have a past year versus a new year, the raw score tells you, did they achieve more points? And so that can help you understand how they're doing against themselves. There's one other type, it's called a composite score, and we'll see it in a few different places throughout. It basically means that you're taking two subtests and adding them together to create a new type of score. So we can see that here with sentence comprehension and passage comprehension are two different subtests. The student got 10 and 11 on those, and they add up to a comprehension composite where you get 21 points. The only thing to remember here is that a composite score is not a new subtest, so it's not necessarily giving you new information. It's just combining scores to look at them in a different way. A percentile is one of my favorite types of scores because while the raw score tells you how a student did compared to themselves, how many points they got, the percentile will compare them to other students that are their same age or grade. So this really gives you a general understanding of how well they're doing compared to the norm. And when I say that, I'm talking about any student. So if your student is 11 years old and 2 months, they would be compared to other 11-year-olds and 2 months. They wouldn't be compared to a 14-year-old or a 9-year-old. So,
can I ask a question?
yeah.
So comparatively, where would those students be coming from? Would they be that age in the same district? Would that be the average across the country?
Exactly. So it's actually the average of any student that age that the test was normed on. So they take tens of thousands of students and norm these tests. So a lot of people ask, is that like students in special education or anything like that? They cross the spectrum of every type of student. So it really gives us a scale of a national average you can think of.
Great, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yep. So when you are thinking about percentiles, though, it is important to keep in mind that we're not just talking about 1 to 100 and what percentage you got. We're more thinking about having the students spread out where they're mostly clumped in the middle. So we're more shooting for that middle range, and I'll show you a graphic later on that helps contribute to that. But the exact middle would be the 50th percentile. They're better than or equal to 50% of the students that took the test. Then when we're talking about the bottom of the average range, it's about the 16th percentile. That's where we start getting into below average. And at the 84th percentile, we start getting into above average. So the range is very wide. And I always say, we're not necessarily jumping for joy when your student hits the 17th percentile on most tests. We're not saying, oh, we did our work, no problem, we're going to move on. That's where we say, okay, we're starting to get into the average range. This is great news, but we still obviously have some work to do. A standard score is very similar to a percentile. They actually move in tandem most of the time, but the scale is different. So you're still comparing your student to all students at their age, and we're still getting kind of a below average, average, or above average range. It's just going to be a slightly different number. So your average range is from 85 to 115, meaning if the standard score is below 84, that would be considered below average. And if it's above 116, it's considered above average. I should note one more thing. So this arrow pointed to an example of that where that's our range. There are one other type of score that's very similar. It's called a scaled score, but we see it on the GORT, which is one popular test that we'll be giving. And that range is actually from 8 to 12. So very similar, but they've just reduced it in this way. So below average would be considered 7 and below, above average would be 13 and above. So one way to look at this is to think about the bell curve, which provides us with the average range. And this is what I was talking about with the percentile. You don't necessarily see this long string of students lined up, evenly spaced one after the other and say, oh, okay, my kid is here. Instead, you would see all of them clumped in the middle, and then they'd be further and further spread out on the ends. So we want to get your students towards that middle pack in this darker blue area. That's where they're going to be kind of living among their peers, able to do the same things as their peers. So that's our kind of goal area. And again, it's a pretty broad range, but that's where we get started, that we're kind of achieving at the same rate as their peers. A Stanine is one other type of score that compares students to their same grade peers. And it only appears on one of our tests, but it can be really useful. And you'll notice on this test, this is the grade, it's our language testing. You'll see that some scores are only providing the raw score and the Stanine. So the Stanine becomes a very useful tool so that you can get a sense of where your student is on each of these subtests. And the Stanine is actually a nice, easy way to think about breaking students into groups of being below average, average, or above, because it stands for standard nines, meaning that they chunk, the first through third Stanine is considered below average, fourth through sixth is average, seventh through ninth is above average. So it's nice chunks that you can think of really simply and then get more information from there. The unfortunate thing to think about, though, is you have a very wide range is spread over only 3 numbers. So there might be, your student might be in the fourth Stanine and stay in the fourth Stanine, but they actually went from the lower end of that all the way to the upper end, and you don't necessarily see that nuance immediately. But it does tell you they're in the average range. One last type of score that we do provide, and this is the one score that I would say to take the most caution with, because a lot of people like to read into the grade equivalent and think that it tells them a lot about the grade level of their student, but it actually doesn't mean anything about the grade level. What it means is that your student got the same raw score as the average student who took the test at that grade. So in this case, the student has a grade equivalent of a 3.9 on a spelling test. That means that the average student in the 9th month of the 3rd grade had a raw score of 39. It doesn't necessarily mean that the student is spelling at the 3rd grade level or that they should be getting words at the 3rd grade level. And that's because it's not really comparing the material that they're using to derive that score.
Megan, can I interrupt with a question?
Yeah.
Where do we look to see the GORT versus the standard score? Or perhaps not score, but test.
So are you, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. So the GORT is a type of test and a standard score is a type of score.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just reading the question from the chat. So maybe you can continue and perhaps I just read that wrong.
Yeah, sorry, that was me, 7th grade mom. I was just looking at the test when you were talking about GORT and it didn't actually call out like where it was saying GORT. So when we get the test back, I guess I was just wondering where we told the difference between that score versus the percentile score.
Yeah,
If
so
that makes sense.
maybe, let me go back to our first sheet. Is this what you're looking at?
I think it was a couple slides forward when you referenced the two things kind of on the same slide.
Okay.
This one, yep, this one right here, where when you talked about GORT under EMS 5 2015 version 5, you said that was the GORT. I just wasn't sure when we get our test back how we tell the difference.
Yes. So when you get your test back, you'll see this.
Okay.
And when I'm talking about the GORT, I'm talking about the gray oral reading test.
Perfect.
And so you'll see that standard score is what it's labeled as. It's actually a scaled score, just a slight difference that doesn't matter much for our purposes, but that's where you would be looking for.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. And I appreciate making sure we clarify that along the way. So I think we're good on grade equivalence. Not my favorite thing in the world, but I understand why we might want to kind of get a sense of roughly, if I have an 8th grader and they have a grade equivalent of 3.9, I might say, okay, so they're not quite on target. But I'd get that information from my percentile and standard score a little more clearly. So that's the only reason that I would suggest looking to those first, rather than jumping over to the grade equivalent. The only other thing to mention about grade equivalence is that your student might get 1 more point and all of a sudden they get 1.7 more grade equivalent points. So they're not evenly spaced. Like 1 point means I move up this amount. You might jump very far or you might get 0.1. So just to keep in mind that there isn't really a standard of how they're divided. So that makes it really challenging to read into that information so much.
Megan, a question from the chat. Do parents receive these scores every year?
Yes, that's a great question. So we do annual standardized testing, which is not always what happens in like a school system, but it really helps us for planning. So at the end of every year, we provide you with that set of scores in June so that you can see kind of where your student is. And I hope you also start to think about ways that you might start considering how these scores relate to who the student is as a student, not just what progress are they making, which is something we'll talk about later. So before we jump into types of tests, I just want to start thinking about how these different scores work together. Because I said at the beginning, if you're only looking at one score, you're only getting part of the information. And it's helpful to look at different scores to give you a sense of how your student is doing. For instance, this student has a grade equivalent. And of course, I can't quite see, so I'm just going to move something really quickly. All right, their grade equivalent goes from 4.7 to 5.4. So I immediately think, oh, they got better. This is great. But when I look further, their percentile has gone from the 27th percentile to the 25th. So this is helping to see that this student is improving. And we can see that in the raw score. They had 63 words that they read correctly the first time, and then 66 words that they read the next time. But that's not enough points compared to their peers to maintain that percentile rank. The good news is they're still in the average range, but we want to make sure that they're kind of keeping up with themselves and gaining as many points as possible. That being said, I'm not necessarily thinking, oh my gosh, this child regressed, because they didn't. They didn't lose points and they're gaining against themselves. So we want to make sure to give credit to them for getting that as well. Another example is that the grade equivalent stays the same. So if we think about the last one where the grade equivalent went up and the percentile went down, we can make the assumption that if the grade equivalent stays the same, that means they didn't really get more points. And the expectation is as you get older, you gain more points on the test. So staying the same is automatically going to show a decrease in the percentile usually. So that means this student went from the 16th percentile to the 9th. I do want to reiterate though, that you want to make sure that you understand that this student is not regressing and that it really matters how they did on the test and what they did. The numbers only give us one piece of information. It's really important to think about, for instance, this is a fluency score about the student's accuracy. If they got the same number of points, but their errors went from crazy guesses to self-corrections, I'm seeing growth in how they're approaching the task. So you can't get that from a number. You really have to understand what the student did in order to get some of that information. This is our last example. So this student goes from a 6.7 to an 8.0 grade equivalent. This really makes me feel good. We're gaining more than a whole grade equivalent, so it's feeling like there's a lot of growth. But when I look at it, this percentile stays the same. So there might be that feeling of disappointment where we're thinking, oh, but they just stayed the same. They obviously didn't get enough. But what I'm really thinking about now is that raw score going from 79 points to 90 is significant, and that the 37th percentile is pretty solidly average. So I'm actually not feeling that disappointment of staying the same. That means the student is maintaining the number of points they need to keep up with themselves and to continue with their peers. So even though this could feel like they're the same, they're improving in the way we would expect. All right, so if there are any other questions on types of scores, I'd be happy to take those now, because then I'm going to shift focus to the types of tests that we give.
I'll just ask generally, and Megan, I know you're obviously an expert in this, and as are many folks at EMS. Is it typical? I realize you're doing this sort of preemptively, right? So to give parents the tools to understand and appreciate the test scores when they receive them. But is it typical that parents really dive into these numbers, or do they more have sort of general questions and perhaps the advisor, you, other folks sort of help to bring a little bit of color towards any progress that happens? I just don't know typically if parents are completely plugged into these numbers or feel that they need to be very aware of the changes.
That's a great question. I would say it really depends on the family and what their situation is. I would say for the most part, you shouldn't expect to feel the same level of expertise that we do. We really live and breathe these tests, these scores. We give them, we analyze them, and we think about these numbers a lot. So don't feel like that should be the level that you're at. But I would say we have a certain group of parents that really wants to know better what these tests mean and what that means for their child. So I would think of this as you know, it depends on who you are. I had one parent say after one of the times that I gave this talk, especially as we started to talk about, so if this score is low and this score is high, how do we think about that? And he was like, so you're just telling me you guys get this and we should trust you. And I was like, if that's where you're at, that's perfect. That's great. But I also don't want you to feel like you have a set of information that you're looking at and you have no idea what you're looking at and whether you should trust us. In that case, I would say reach out to your advisor, reach out to me. We're happy to talk about your particular child and what those scores mean.
Fantastic. And one question from the chat. If the goal is to close the gap of grade level, does that percentile need to increase to reach that goal?
It's going to depend. And I think I almost sent you guys an article on what grade level means, but I felt like it would be too heady to use. So basically, there's grade level is a more subjective term than we like to think it is. And what you're going to see is you actually want to think about in my students' class, in tutorial, what grade level book are they able to access? What grade level fluency are they using? Those are going to give you more of a barometer about what your student can access and how easily they can access that material. The percentile, for instance, could remain very low. I'm thinking of certain students that I've had in the past that have very low fluency scores, but that's because they are methodical, slow readers, and they're able to use that information, understand high-level text, and continue to move forward. So I'm not necessarily thinking every score percentile needs to be at a certain point to close that gap. What I'm going to be thinking about is what can my student access and how comfortably within the average range can we get? And it's going to be different for different tests. So for instance, I might care very much about their word reading, but I might not care as much about the spelling, depending on what tools I'm going to ask the student to use.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So let's talk about those tests a little bit. We're going to start with the Kaufman test of educational achievement. We actually give 3 different subtests, but I broke them down in 2 different ways because 2 of them really go together and 1 of them is separate. So on this test, we give 2 different forms so that we can give it yearly and feel like it's a look at what that student is doing each year. Oops, sorry. So the first subtest that we give is letter word recognition. That is a student's ability to read real words. If they're very young, they actually might need to provide letter names or sounds at the beginning as well. But most of it is focused on word recognition. So their ability to read a real word accurately. And this is also a strong predictor of overall reading ability. So a high word recognition would mean that students are comfortable reading a range of words. These aren't like the words that the tutor's giving that would be very isolated and patterned and thoughtful. They range from a sight word and they get harder and harder, and they have multi-syllable words and silent letters and lots of different patterns embedded. So that's going to give us a real look at, in the real world, how is that student able to read?
Megan, a question from the chat, and I think this definitely pertains to our students' real world experience, is you had mentioned tutorial. So what section corresponds with tutorial?
So what section of test or what section of their school day?
No, sorry, go ahead. just to clarify, I guess we're asking like what section of the test, as we look at the test and we think about her day, where is she getting kind of the focus or the, I guess the information to improve those specific test categories, if that hopefully clarifies.
Absolutely, that's perfect. So the most students are going to be working on letter word recognition. They'll work in some nonsense words, although that ties directly into word recognition, spelling, and those language areas on the grade, which we'll get to later. So comprehension and different parts of reading. So the tutorial is going to be all directed towards reading and spelling. And there's actually only one test that I'm going to talk about, which is the math testing that doesn't correspond to tutorial. The one difference I would say is that because we are a language-based school and all of our teachers are tutorial teachers, that means that in the language arts class and in the science class, you're still going to have a language teacher. So a lot of those pieces will also be addressed throughout the rest of the school day, language-wise.
Great. Another question, without getting too much into demographics or different districts, where does the quote word average come from? And maybe you were going to reference this in the article you mentioned. Is that a national average or is it something else?
Great. When we're talking about percentiles and standard scores, we're talking about national averages. The difference you're going to see from a district to another district to landmark is what criterion they have that allows a student to access special education. For us, you know, your student could be at the 50th percentile and we still see areas that we would want to work on, and we're able to freely do that, versus that would be highly uncommon in a public school setting to have a student at the 50th percentile and getting services.
Great, thank you. I think it's fair to say too that across the country and even the demographics within our own school, our students' needs and skill set vary so much, which is one of the reasons that all of this testing happens and why it's so thoughtful as to the class design and the curriculum, and why we don't have 7th grade English, because that's not appropriate for our students. So it's just worth noting that all of this helps to shape what our students are receiving every day and every year.
Absolutely. Thanks. So the next subtest that I'm going to talk about is nonsense word decoding. So nonsense words are actually very informative because they play fair. And that basically means that a nonsense word will follow an expected pattern within the English language. So I'm not going to have a nonsense word that's QPRST because that's not decodable in English. But I will have QU and expect my student to know that that's going to say qua. So all of those nonsense words help us recognize which patterns they're able to decode and which ones still need work. So I just want to think a little bit about what different scores might mean to you. This is the sample student who has taken both of these tests. Their nonsense words are at the 45th percentile, meaning that they're strongly average. And their word recognition is at the 14th percentile, meaning that it's below average. So what this says to me is that this student actually can recognize a set of patterns that has been taught to them and can use those to decode words. This means that they have some of these building blocks, skills that are important to reading. But when it comes to real words, the different types of patterns that are expected and the amount of flexibility in the English language is more of a demand. And so they aren't able to apply those skills and come close enough to the real word to call it out. So this is a really good sign, though. This means that the student has some really solid base skills that we can work off of and become more flexible with all of these decoding patterns.
Megan, another question from the chat. Are we comparing to a national average of children who take the test? I would think that the only children taking the test are those that might be falling behind. So is this really comparing against the national average of kids with no potential learning disabilities?
That's an excellent question. The reality is that they don't take it on every student that's taking the test. What they do in order to create the test is they build these norming samples. So they're actually looking for a wide demographic spread, not just students with learning disabilities or students who are high flyers. None of that. They're really looking across the scope. In fact, a lot of them will give us a comparison so we can see how do students that have learning disabilities compare to the national average. And as you would guess, it's generally a little bit lower. But what the numbers we're using to compare students to is the national average on this wide ranging group.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the next type of test I'm going to talk about is the GORT. That's the Gray Oral Reading Test. It's the most common fluency test that's given. You've probably seen it from your outside evaluators, from your school systems, and from Landmark. So it's very popular. We do want to cover a few things because it is also a little more stringent in the way that it tests different pieces. So you get a rate score, meaning the student gets a number of points for how quickly they can read each passage. These are not like grade level passages or anything like that. They start at a pretty easy passage and they just get harder and harder and harder and harder. The complexity builds and they have to get those points within a certain number of seconds. There's also an accuracy score, meaning how many points can the student get for reading the words on the page is exactly as they're written. This is where we see the most difficulty based on how the test is scored. And that's because we obviously want to count against students when they read the wrong word. So when they substitute a word or they misread a word. But this is also going to count against them anytime they repeat themselves, make a self-correction. Any of those things that we might actually consider good reading skills are counted as errors. And that's within reason, because sometimes if a student goes too quickly and has to correct themselves consistently, that's problematic. But we also want to teach our kids that if you make a mistake, go back, correct that so that you understand what you're reading. Those two scores put together create a fluency score. So you can consider this a composite score. And you just want to be very careful that when you add up the rate and accuracy, it makes sense to look at them together as one score. And we'll talk about that a little later too. The last score is the comprehension score. We ask the students 5 different questions after the test is given. This is more challenging than it sounds. So the student reads a short passage. We take that passage away from them and we ask a question that is open-ended. So they have to come up with all of the answers. So it taps into memory. It also taps into their ability to find information that was given to them, and they have to have decoded that correctly as well. So there's a lot that goes into the comprehension score. So here's an example of a student who has exactly what I was talking about. Their rate is at the 37th percentile, meaning it's solidly average, but their accuracy is at the 5th percentile, which is well below average. So this could be several different things. It could mean that they move so quickly that they're not reading accurately. They might be making errors that aren't connected to, that are connected to context. So they're still getting the gist, but they're making a lot of little errors, or they're having to self-correct a lot. This is a pattern I don't love. I would prefer my students to have a slow pace and be highly accurate, because it's more likely that they're going to get an understanding of the test. Two things of note here: this student is actually still average with their comprehension, meaning that it's probably not making a major impact on their ability to read this passage, that they're moving too quickly, but we still want to get them to slow down so that they can be even more accurate. And then when you're looking at that fluency score, you probably want to disregard the fluency when it's such a stark difference between the rate and the accuracy. When you add those two together, it doesn't really tell you whether they're fluent or not, because we can tell that they're reading too fast and not being accurate enough. If we want to compare, this is another type of profile that we actually often see, where students reading words, so either real words or nonsense words, the student's pretty accurate. They're stronger with their nonsense words, where that's at the 42nd percentile, so very solidly average. But their letter word recognition is also average, it's just at the lower end of the average range. But then when we go to the court and we look at their fluency, those are all well below average. So this suggests to us that this student is able to decode, and they're even able to apply a lot of those decoding skills to real words. But when I put all of those words together in a single passage and try to make them read accurately, that's where it becomes too challenging. They can't apply all of those skills quick enough to maintain their accuracy. So that's why this student, we would call them a fluency student, where they need to focus more on fluency skills. There's one other subtest that we give from the Kaufman test of educational achievement, and that is the spelling test. This is also a pretty harsh spelling test. What it does is the student has to spell words that grow in complexity. They have to physically write them, so they're not choosing different words or different options. They have to come up with the spelling all on their own from a dictated list. And they need to spell accurately. We can query if it's illegible, but if your student has difficulty with reversals like B's and D's, those actually automatically count against them, even if they were able to say that's a B. We have to count it as wrong because it creates another letter. So sometimes students can have even lower scores than the expectation because of that issue. Though I would say that spelling tends to be an area that is most challenging because it taps into all of your literacy skills and asks you to come up with all of it from your head, rather than reading where you can rely on the page. You just have to know those patterns and break them down.
Megan, a few questions in the chat. The first is, how do you interpret the scores if the decoding is lower than the recognition?
So that is a challenging one, because what it basically means is that the student has probably gotten by with some strong sight vocabulary, that they can see what the words are and know them. They have that recognition, but they're not necessarily applying decoding skills to do that. So sometimes that means we have to break some old habits, because there comes a point where if a student is no longer able to memorize a bunch of words, and I'm not saying that's the only thing that they're doing, but that would make that too challenging to continue with that practice. So we really need to reinforce pattern learning at that point. The one time we sometimes see a drop down in nonsense word reading is when a student has been getting phonemic awareness practice through lips. And then the next year, when they don't have lips, sometimes they have a little drop because it's not a primary focus of using nonsense words all the time. That's not necessarily scary. It's when the kids, we really want to break old habits. That's what I'm more thinking of.
Great. Another question, do these tests help dictate what they work on in tutorial?
That's exactly it. So we really use these tests along with, if it's a returning student, we're going to use a ton of other information from their daily practice, but it really helps guide us to what the focus of tutorial is going to be and how we might address certain areas. We also have a lot of our own in-house testing and daily diagnostic notes from the tutor of the previous year and the academic advisor to play off of as well. And that's going to be very important, but the tests do help drive what we're doing.
Great. And one more, what is a doctoral list? Is it multiple choice?
A dictated list means that I would say a word and the student has to write it down. So there's no multiple choice, which is a type of spelling test. But in this case, they don't have anything to rely on. It's all, you can think of it as a difference between receptive task, where they see a few options and have to choose one, and an expressive task. I'm sorry, my cat is deciding today is the moment that he wants to be known. But a dictated list means that they can only use that expressive where they're writing out the words themselves.
Great, thank you.
All right. So the next test we're going to talk about is the group reading assessment and diagnostic evaluation, known as the grade. And this is a multiple choice test. So this is a more receptive task where the answers are available for the students. And they are using all grade level material. So a second grader is going to take a second grade test. A sixth grader is going to take a sixth grade test. And our seventh and eighth graders actually take what's called a middle school test, so that they're taking the same test, but we have different forms, so they're not seeing the same test all the time. There are a few different areas that we're looking at. We're looking at vocabulary. So a student sees a word and finds a synonym, and sentence comprehension, passage comprehension, and then listening comprehension. And I'll go into each of those as we go. So for vocabulary, I just mentioned it. This is where a student has a word and they need to find a synonym or phrase that matches. For our youngest students, our second and third graders, they actually have a few different types of subtests as well. So they both have the word reading, which means that a teacher reads a word and they look at 4 different words and they have to choose which word was read to them. So that gives a sense of, can students recognize words that are read to them? Can they tell the difference between visually similar words, that type of thing? So it's really thinking about their strength in reading. And then for second graders, they also get word meaning, meaning that they see a word and they have 4 pictures and they have to select the picture that goes with that, or yes, and then they have to select the picture that goes with that word, versus vocabulary where you have a word and you have to select another word. So that's more reading based. Sentence comprehension basically means it's a cloze activity, CLOZE, meaning that there's a blank in the middle of the sentence or at any part of the sentence, and the student has to select the right word that would match. The one difference on this test is they were really intentional about using different parts of speech throughout. So it might be missing a noun, meaning a person, place, or thing, or it might be missing a preposition, like a where word or a when word, showing us just thinking about kind of those little nuances. Was it at the park or for the park? So lots of little things. We also have passage comprehension. This is a pretty familiar type of test where you basically read a passage and then you have a set of multiple choice questions that you answer about that passage. The passages do range from all different types of reading. So you get fiction, nonfiction, poetry, letters, all of those different types that you might see. But the questions are pretty typical. So we're looking at main ideas, details, inferencing, understanding about characters, setting and plot, that type of thing. And the last one is listening comprehension. When we chose a comprehension test, it was really important to us to have a listening comprehension portion of that would help us understand the difference between, is this a reading issue or is this more of a language issue? And there's a lot of other things we'll try to key in on as far as what else listening can be. But it basically tells us, is the student able to read and answer questions? Are they also able to hear something that's being read and answer questions about it? The format of this one really boils it down to, it takes away some of the memory components because the student has a few sentences that are being read to them. And then there's a set of 4 pictures and they have to choose which one matches. It is really tapping into things like literal or non-literal meaning. So you might have the kid did a new activity. He really got his feet wet and he dove right in. And maybe there's a kid standing in a puddle versus a kid really ready to start a new activity. And it might also have something that's just talking about like a difference in your prepositions again. So did we do this before or after? And you have to pick the picture that matches that. So they're not easy, even though they're just sitting there listening to someone read to them. So let's look at a few different ways that we can see this. So this student has kind of weaker vocabulary. They're at the 8th percentile, meaning they're below average with their vocabulary. So reading a word and picking out a synonym. But their comprehension composite is at the 17th percentile. So we're not necessarily in huge differences here, but now we're approaching the average range with that 17th percentile. So what that often suggests when vocabulary is lower and comprehension is higher is that the student's relying more on context. So they're having a harder time with their decoding. Their word recognition might actually be lower, meaning that they can't just pick out a word and figure out the synonym for it because they're actually having trouble reading those words. Versus when you have your comprehension, if you have an entire passage or a sentence, you can use a lot of the information within the sentence that you can decode to help figure out the meaning of different parts of that. So they might be relying more on that context and general understanding to figure out the answers. This student is kind of the opposite. You can see their vocabulary is at the 44th percentile, so very solid. Their sentence comprehension is also average. They're at the 4th stanine. So it's just the beginning of the average range, but it is average, whereas their passage comprehension is at the first A9, meaning they're well below average. And that meant that the comprehension composite is at the 10th percentile. So we're not seeing that solidly average composite score like the vocabulary. What this probably means is that the student can use all of these decoding skills and can take the pieces and put them together because they're only needing to decode one word here and pick a synonym or figure out from a sentence what's missing. But when you ask them to do that within an entire passage, the load on their reading work is really weighing down on them, and they're not able to put all of those things together and derive meaning from the passage. The one other thing I would say about this is that 10th percentile is kind of a misdirect, because if you have a fourth A9 paired with a first A9, you're putting together two unlike things and trying to say that that 10th percentile means something. So in fact, the 10th percentile is at the third A9, and we might think, oh, good, they're approaching average. But really, they're at the bottom end of the average range in one thing and well below average, something we really want to work on in the other thing. So you have to make sure that you're looking at all of those pieces, not just that 10th percentile. This student has a listening comprehension that's at the 7th A9. That means they're above average. I will also say we looked at that score of a 16 when we were looking at raw scores, and we said, we don't know what that means. It's 16 out of 17. So this is solid. Definitely something the student can do. And then when we look at their sentence and passage comprehension, that's all adding up to about the 17th percentile. So on one end, we're above average. On the other end, we're like maybe just sneaking into the average range or a little below average. This suggests to us that this student has good language skills. They can listen to information, process that language, and figure out what's being asked of them, what's being said. But when they're asked to read it themselves, what's taxing their memory, their decoding skills, all of that put together is too much, and they're not able to show that understanding. This disconnect often helps us figure out like, oh, we still have plenty of reading work we need to do, because we want that to become closer. They might never be exactly the same, but we want them to be closer to the same. The last type of test that I'm going to talk about tonight is the Basic Achievement Skills Inventory, or the BASI is what we call it. And this is our math testing. So they actually no one's taken that this spring yet. So all students will take it, I think it's next week. So get ready for that. Basically, what this is telling us, we have two different subtests, a computation and an application, and we're looking at different types of math skills. Second graders do not have a normed test for this, so they don't take it. The third and fourth graders take one test, the level 1. The fifth and sixth graders take the level 2, and the seventh and eighth graders take the level 3. Keep in mind that that does mean that a third grader might be seeing fourth grade material. So this is that type of test. You're not necessarily looking to get every answer right. You want to get the same number of points as the average kid in your grade. So when we're looking at this, we have two different subtests. We have math computation. That means that we're looking at the ability for students to take the numbers given in math and put them together. So generally, it's something that's very straightforward. They'll say, compute this problem, 5,942 times 164. And the student just has to do that work to come up with the answer. This is a timed test, so they have 20 minutes to complete a about 30 problems, depending on grade, which means that the expectation is that they move quickly. We do also provide the raw score for untimed because we know that our students don't always do well in a timed format. The next type of subtest is math application. This is your word problems. So whereas before I might give this long string of numbers, I have to do a lot of different steps to get the right answer. And you can be sure, because it's a multiple choice test, that any misstep I would commonly make, there's going to be an answer for that so that they can find that. Even sneakier on the computation, there's often an answer E, which is none of the above, which feels really mean to me. On math application, instead, the math work that you have to do is generally fairly straightforward, but the student has to figure out what it's asking for. So they might just have to add two numbers or multiply two numbers, but it's going to say that with a lot of language embedded. And for our kids, that can often be a challenge. So this is one student we can look at, one example where the computation is at the 34th percentile and the application is at the 2nd percentile. Oh, I'm sorry, this was my timed versus untimed example. So same thing, we're going to switch it up a little bit. I bet I have, there we go. So this math application, those word problems are at the 2nd percentile, meaning that it's well below average. We can see that our student only scored 4 correctly. But on our untimed, oops, sorry about that. On our untimed, they got all the way up to 20. So this is a student that actually has the skill, but they need more time to get the work done, especially if there's language involved. So this would be an example of a student that you would really want to think about, you know, if you were going to apply to other private schools and the student had to take standardized testing, you might request extra time because they clearly need that time to process language and figure out what they have to do. It's not necessarily they don't have the skill to do it in.
Megan, on that theme, we have a question. How much of this testing is guidance for Landmark to guide tutorial and class placement versus informing returning to public school and or guidance for staying at Landmark or another school option? For example, aside from progress, what should we leverage these tests for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one I can't fully answer. So we use all of this testing to inform our instruction. So it's definitely going to be used for that. The reason I can't answer the question fully about how you should use it in thinking about a transition for your student is that placement matters. And all of those non-testing skills matter too. So you could have a kid who's an amazing reader, they're really strong, they've gotten tons of their basic skills really worked out through their years at Landmark, but they really struggle with the executive function pieces, and the school that you're looking at asks a lot of independence on organizing homework and making sure that you have all your materials, and the expectation is going to be very high, then that might not be the right fit for your student, and the scores might not say anything about that. On the flip side of that, if you had your eye on a very specific placement that was highly supportive and not every score was perfect, that might still be a discussion with your advisor about, you know, how would your student handle this transition? What is the placement going to provide that makes that the right place for them after Landmark? So it's a really individual discussion.
Great, thanks.
All right. So I think this is my last example, and it's the same thing that I started to talk about before. So this is a student whose computation score is very strong at the 34th percentile, meaning that all of those math pieces, they can do multi-step problems, they can figure out what they need to do, and when it's explicitly told to them, and do it, versus on the application at the second percentile, all that language involved figuring out what they have to do is what's really taxing them. We do see the flip of this as well, where a student might actually have a strong application and weak computation, and that usually falls under executive function. So things like a student's ability to recognize that they need to have a negative sign, or that they have to carry the one. All of those little pieces, that's goes into the multi-step parts. So you really have to think about all the different parts that can go wrong, and that can be a challenge as well, versus a kid who has figured out, how to decode a math problem and see what it's asking for. All right. Any other questions that you guys have about what I've covered or similar topics?
I'll ask Megan, what's the sort of emotional preparedness for students when this testing happens? Is it throughout the year, so they sort of expect it on a regular basis? Or is there a lot of sort of conversation leading up to it? Because I appreciate a lot of our kids are coming from schools or stressful situations where this testing was not a pleasant experience for them.
Absolutely. I think it's really going to depend on the kid, and what's that baggage they're carrying. I can tell you a few different experiences that I've had. We've had kids who we have to test our new students in the fall, so there's not as much preparation that goes into taking these tests and what it looks like. And we've had students who really can't do it in the fall, that say, like, I'm done, I'm not able to do this anymore. Or there are tears, which always kills me, because we're often asking them to do something that they are not good at and to do it independently. And often what we see in the spring, even if those scores don't change distinctively, that there might be a different approach to the test, and sometimes even a confidence that they can do it. Or we have those kids that go from, oh my gosh, this took me all day long, to now I figured out some strategies to make this testing work for me and feel less painful, and to get through it more easily.
Great. And a question from the chat: when in June will the test results be available? Will that be with final grades?
Yes, that comes with your final reports. So generally, I would say you're looking at after the end of the school year. That being said, if you open up your reports and you look at this and you're like, I know we talked about this, but it's all gibberish to me now, you can still reach out. And if your advisor is not available, I'm happy to connect with you as well.
Fantastic. Well, I'll give folks just another minute to raise any questions they might have. Yes, this question came up. Will you share the slides, and is this session recorded? Yes, it is. I hope we'll get this in the EMS newsletter this week. If not, it will be in the following week. So yep, you'll have this recording and the slides, and that'll be on the Landmark Learns homepage as well if you wanted to share it with anyone.
Excellent.
All right, well, Megan, thank you so much. I know typically we would have done this in person and asked a variety of questions, but I think we had some fantastic questions tonight. It was worked out really well to have a small group, and I know how much work and effort you put into this. So thank you so much. I know you take great care of those kids.
Anytime. I'm impressed. I just saw the time that people stuck with me for 1 hour and 15 minutes. So thank you to you guys.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your spring and hope to see you soon. Take good care.